Carlos kept his back to the window, as if the pale Madrid afternoon could shelter him from the sudden, private collapse of dignity. Snow was beginning to feather against the glass, thin, stubborn flakes that blurred the avenue into a watercolor of lights and muffled footsteps. He had dressed carefully, the gray wool coat his wife had bought him on their last small trip, a collar that still felt like reprimand and comfort at once. Lucia's mittened hand fit inside his, warm and trusting. He reminded himself, absurdly, that a good parent steadied his face for his child even when every nerve wanted to fold inward. If any of that steadiness remained, it left by the time the woman at the table rose and said plainly, "I won't be staying." Her voice was smooth as porcelain and hard as a plate dropped on tile. She wore a fur collar, faux if the light was kind, and a perfume that smelled like winter apples and a life Carlos had never had. She hesitated only long enough for the maitre d' to offer a smile that did not reach his eyes, then turned to the waiter and added, "We have a reservation for 2. Perhaps there's somewhere else." The waiter moved as if led by a rope. He touched Carlos's chair with an apologetic hand that meant, unmistakably, "You are in the wrong place." Carlos heard the words, but not the small inflection of pity that followed. The woman, Beatrice, he learned afterwards, when Pilar called to berate him for not making a better impression, said nothing to Lucia. Why would she? Lucia sat with her lips numb from the cold, the faint red of a scraped thumb where she had refused Carlos's offer of a handkerchief. She had been excited earlier when he'd explained the plan. "A nice restaurant, Papa," she had said, and the particular gravity in the way she pronounced "nice" had been a kind of faith he could not betray. He had accepted the blind date because Pilar had promised it would be harmless. 2 parents alone for a quiet lunch, an option to leave if it felt wrong. He had not counted on the slow cruelty of another person deciding, with the ease of choosing a dessert, that he and his daughter were less than the table's expectations. Words of apology seemed small and useless in the face of fast, efficient dismissal. The woman folded her scarf as if folding a letter she never meant to open. She said she was allergic to certain sounds, to certain rhythms of life. And in that moment, Carlos wondered if she meant to be cruel, or if cruelty had simply grown polite and clean. The maitre d' cleared the table with the same efficient care of someone erasing an inconvenience. The waiter offered an embarrassed look and a suggestion. There was a simpler room at the back, family tables. The stew was very good. Carlos could feel the weight of stares from the other patrons, murmurs that might be curiosity or the solidarity of people glad to not be the ones displaced. Lucia, who had been watching with the odd, blunt clarity that children keep, reached for the menu and then, as if making a choice that seemed natural to her, set it aside. "Papa," she said, the word both a tether and a tug, "we can get the stew." She said it so plainly there was no room for shame in it. Her small voice cut the hum of the room. For a moment, Carlos held her hand so tight his knuckles whitened. He had rehearsed for nights how to handle humiliation without breaking the promise he had made as a father, to protect, to explain when needed, and to show that loss had not made them smaller. He stood, smoothing his coat with shaky fingers, telling himself that he would take Lucia to the back room. He would make a small ceremony of the stew, Remedias's kind, generous cooking that reminded him of afternoons when Mariana had been alive, laughing at him for boiling pasta too long. He imagined the warmth of the soup would gather his scattered self together, like sunlight drawing moths. Before they reached the doorway, a woman at the next table touched his sleeve. Carlos turned, expecting irritation or the customary silence of strangers who had witnessed discomfort. Instead, she pushed a small matte card across the varnished wood by the candle. The card was heavy, thick as a promise, and when he read the name, Elena, his eyes found hers. She was not his blind date. She was someone else entirely. A woman with a coat the color of dusk and hands that rested on the table as if they had always known how to fix rips and mend edges. She smiled the kind of small, contained smile that did not make much of an announcement but made space. "It's for you," she said, and the voice did not have the chilly reserve of the other table. Her accent was Madrid through and through, but softened by a grammar of books, the quiet cadence of someone who listened more than spoke. "If you ever want a quiet place to read, or if your little girl likes stories, call me." Carlos wanted to refuse. He wanted to fold the card, throw it into the same tray where the maitre d' kept the billfolds and the silver receipts of an afternoon that had almost erased them. His pride tugged like a leaden tug. And yet he could not. He let his fingers close around the card, feeling the tooth of the paper like a small, honest thing. Lucia peered, chin propped on two clenched fists, and when Elena winked toward her, Lucia laughed, a high, uncomplicated sound that made the waiter look up and a few heads turn. "Thank you," Carlos said, in the voice left after the other one had been taken. He felt ridiculous and grateful in the same breath. The combination made him feel young and raw. Elena's hand, when she brushed it across the card to point out her name, was warm. "You shouldn't have to be made small for someone else's taste," she added. And the words arrived without theater, straightforward, true. They moved to the back room where the stew smelled of bay leaves and slow afternoons. Remedios herself, the owner cook who ran the neighborhood place with the sort of maternal authority only chefs and grandmothers possess, ladled the soup into a chipped bowl for Lucia and offered Carlos a plate of stew with a wink that meant, "I know what it is to be left alone at a table." For a while the embarrassment lay in both their bellies like grit, but the stew warmed them slowly. And at the table by the window, Elena finished the last of her own dessert and left without ceremony, her coat collar turned up against the thin, inquisitive snow. Carlos watched her go, the card now folded in his pocket like a small, illicit thing. At home later, with Lucia tucked into the crook of his arm and the apartment whispering with its thin heat, he unfolded the card again. He checked the phone number. He checked his bank account, on reflex, the old arithmetic of a man who knew what it meant to count coins for medicine and milk. None of that mattered. He thought of Mariana, her laughter that had once filled the kitchen, the smell of lemon oil she favored, the gentle way she had soothed Lucia to sleep. Mariana's absence was not a wound that could be pointed out on a map. It was the weather of their rooms. That night he called the number. The voice at the other end belonged to Elena. It sounded like someone who had woken early and put on kindness as if it were a sweater. She said hello so simply he could imagine her in her apartment with a tray of teacups, perhaps a stack of manuscripts nearby. She asked, without hurry, about Lucia, about what stories the child liked, and when he confessed that they owned very few children's books, those they had were ones Mariana had left with careful pressure, Elena offered a laugh. "I run a small press for children," she said. "It's a bit of a mess and a lot of heart. If you ever need books, come by, or bring Lucia. We have cookies on Thursdays." She did not say anything about charity. She framed it like an invitation, genuine and leveled, which made the offer easier to accept. The next day they met in the park, where the snow had turned to a damp chalk on the paths. Elena arrived with a small tote of paperbacks and a thermos that smelt faintly of cinnamon. Lucia took to her at once, drawn by a colorful cover and the promise of a cookie. Carlos watched them from a park bench, hands cupped around a hot cup that burned in the places grief had left hollow. He studied Elena's face, the narrow bridge of her nose, the soft line of her mouth when she smiled at something Lucia said. There was wealth in Elena's hands, the way she carried herself, and the small, easy authority with which she moved through the city. But there was also a tenderness that complicated simple impressions. She did not look down at their modest clothes. She looked like someone who had learned at length how to meet people as they were. The next day they met in the park, where the snow had turned to a damp chalk on the paths. Elena arrived with a small tote of paperbacks and a thermos that smelled faintly of cinnamon. Lucia took to her at once, drawn by a colorful cover and the promise of a cookie. Carlos watched them from a park bench, hands cupped around a hot cup that burned in the places grief had left hollow. He studied Elena's face, the narrow bridge of her nose, the soft line of her mouth when she smiled at something Lucia said. There was wealth in Elena's hands, the way she carried herself, and the small, easy authority with which she moved through the city. But there was also a tenderness that complicated simple impressions. She did not look down at their modest clothes. She looked like someone who had learned at length how to meet people as they were. They walked among the bare trees, Elena telling stories about the books she edited, paperbacks with ragged edges that had changed a child's perspective, and Carlos, in the intimacy of the conversation, spoke about teaching. He taught literature at a small secondary school. He loved the way stories could be scaffolds for a teenager's changing self. He did not talk about the parts that still hurt, the hospital corridor, the empty chair at the school parents' nights. But when Lucia asked him why the snow made him sad sometimes, he found a way to say, simply, that some kind of cold was harder to warm. Elena listened without prying. She told him, in small shards, that she had built a company from a desk in her mother's kitchen, that she had learned to ask the right questions and to listen for truths in the margins of manuscript pages. She spoke about her parents briefly, with affection. Esteban, who kept late hours at the hardware store, and Francisca, who could knit a sweater in a week and loved the radio programs in the afternoons. The detail corrected a first impression. She had money, yes, but not the glossy, inherited kind that makes people look at others as less. Her wealth had been earned with work and stubborn affection for stories. Carlos felt, inexplicably, a relief, as if some rounded edge of the world had fallen into place. Their meetings multiplied in small, believable increments. Elena came by the apartment once to drop off a stack of brightly illustrated books. She sat on Carlos's couch, an old thing with a sag in the middle, without ceremony, and read to Lucia. The child curled up between them, the book balanced on little knees, and for a while the apartment held a sound Carlos had not heard in years: 3 people laughing at the same line. It was not the same as before, it did not pretend to be, but it was company, and company made the room feel less like a shrine. Neighbors noticed. Dolores from next door, with her cane and her quick humor, began to bring by a plate when there was something warming on the stove. Remedios sent an extra pot of stew with the clear maternal claim of someone who had been watching the household's weather. These small actions stitched the city into a kind of network that caught them when pride threatened to tumble them again. Not everything moved gently. Pilar, with the righteous certainty of a woman who felt obliged to be vigilant over her son's life decisions, phoned and demanded to know whether Carlos had actually given Lucia to someone he barely knew. Mariana's parents, Teresa and Joaquin, observed from a distance, their loyalty to a memory complicated by the necessity of the present. They feared that a new woman might step into Mariana's place and efface the years they could not recover. Carlos listened, and he chose his words with the tenderness of someone who understood that explaining would not necessarily mean being forgiven. "She's not replacing anyone," he told them once, over a coffee that went cold while he measured his sentences. "She's a person who loves books and makes Lucia laugh. That's all we're asking for." In the editorial world, tea-stained manuscripts, lunches where success smelled of saffron and the clean lines of modern Spanish cafes, Elena was both admired and whispered about. Some colleagues, who measured worth in acquisitions and the shimmer of glossy imprints, could not understand why she would bother with someone like Carlos. At a dinner that would later prove pivotal, one of Elena's colleagues commented, too loud for the background music, that Elena's taste in men had decidedly shifted since she started signing picture book deals. The remark was blandly cruel. Elena's response, later, would be careful and quiet, but clear. She would not be ashamed to choose someone who loved a child and a book. Still, the editorial night left ripples. texts that read like gossip, and an invitation that was not so much extended as burdened. Carlos navigated these tides the only way he knew how, with a guarded honesty. He answered Elena's questions about his life plainly. He admitted he was not eager to introduce a woman as something other than what she was, because the past took up space and should be acknowledged rather than airbrushed. He told her, once when they sat beneath winter-bare plane trees, that he sometimes dreamed of a life where Mariana's laugh echoed again through a small kitchen. Elena listened, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, and told him she was willing to learn the shape of the gaps he carried. Lucia was the true measure. She tested all adults with the minimal cruelty and maximal clarity of children. At first, she treated Elena like a new toy, interesting, to be picked up and set aside. Then, slowly, she began to accept. Elena read at bedtime, helped untangle a yarn of felted hair, taught Lucia a silly song about a bird who lost his hat. The crucial moments were small. Elena showing up with 2 umbrellas when the forecast promised rain, Elena making a paper lantern for a school craft, and sitting through the after-school movie when Carlos's phone rang with a parent-teacher emergency. The Festival of Lanterns arrived with a promise of thaw. Each child in the neighborhood had prepared a small paper vessel lit by a candle, and Lucia's was a clumsy, earnest thing, painted with yellow suns and a lopsided heart. Carlos held her hand as they walked into the plaza, where lanterns floated and swayed like cautious hopes. Elena's presence beside them felt plain and necessary. She carried Lucia's extra glove in her pocket and held the plastic cup of hot chocolate that the vendor offered with care. Nearby, Teresa and Joaquin watched with a look that had room for both skepticism and, beneath it, the softening that time affords. When Lucia said aloud, surprised and fierce, "You must pass the test," it was neither a joke nor a judgment. In a child's economy of fairness, people had to earn their way into a family. Elena turned to her with a smile that was equal parts apology and pledge. "What's the test?" she asked. Lucia considered the question like a small sovereign weighing a decree. "You must not make Papa cry," she decided at last, solemn as a queen. It was at once the simplest and the most profound of criteria. Elena reached for Carlos's hand, the gesture unannounced and genuine, and squeezed. There were other tests. At an editorial dinner, where Elena's world and Carlos's intersected most awkwardly, the careful harmonies of their quiet relationship were tested by noise. The tables were set with polished cutlery that flashed like small suns, and the conversation was dense with terminology Carlos had little need to know. Pilar came unexpectedly with a friend, and Teresa and Joaquin arrived to avoid a perceived slight. Beatrice, there again, like a shadowy refrain, sat at the next table, the same frost in her voice. The conversation sharpened. "You're making a serious step," Pilar said to Carlos when dessert arrived. Her eyes measured him as one would measure a length of fabric, checking for holes that could not be mended. "Are you sure she understands what your life with Lucia is like?" Carlos would later replay the tone of that question as if it had been a stone thrown. He understood why Pilar feared haste, but he also knew that caution could calcify into a prison. He had spent years living in a world where decisions were smoothed by practicality. The school form filled late, the appointment that could not be missed. He longed for tenderness without theatrics. That night, in a small private corridor where sound softened, he took Elena's hand and did not ask permission to love. Instead, he asked for partnership. "With Lucia," he said, "with us." Elena's answer was the kind of thing that did not need grand speeches. She leaned into him and whispered, for only him to hear, "I want to learn." It was a sentence of action. It carried with it the weight of a woman who had run a company and managed budgets and deadlines. She knew what commitment looked like on paper. It was also, improbably, a sentence that fit neatly around a child's heart. Yet the real crisis came not from the editorial gossip nor from the in-laws, but from a professional opportunity that threatened to uproot the fragile, happy arrangement. A fellowship in Barcelona, short and prestigious, was offered to Carlos. An invitation to teach for a semester at a university with better pay and a chance for steady income. It was the sort of opportunity that could tilt a teetering balance. Accepting meant warmth and security for Lucia. It also meant the possibility of distance from Elena, whose publishing house was anchored in Madrid. He sat at his kitchen table with Elena's card, now bearing smudged edges from nights of being traced, and the fellowship letter between his thumb and forefinger. Lucia's coloring books lay scattered like small constellations, their edges smudged with crayon. Above all, a quiet fear hovered. If he left, would the rhythm they had found survive? Would Elena's willingness translate into an acceptance that could bridge a city? He thought of Mariana and all the careful promises he had made to her memory, how honoring her did not preclude choosing a future. He thought of the way Lucia had said, matter of fact, that the new woman must not make Papa cry. He thought of Elena's quiet authority and the way her laughter had fit into the apartment like a familiar book returned to its shelf. That night he dialed the number that had first felt like an odd, almost scandalous intrusion. He rehearsed various endings: a courteous refusal to accept the fellowship, an arrangement where they would try to manage distance, or a plan for Elena to help arrange summer visits. When Elena answered, the frankness of her voice made him speak plainly. "It's an offer," he said, "for a semester. It could help, but—" He paused, because the heart of the matter was not money. It could move us away. Elena listened. The pause between them held the map of choices. Then she said, simply, "Tell me where it is. Tell me when it starts." Her voice carried the steady practicality of a woman used to solving problems on a deadline. "We'll make a plan." Carlos put down the phone with a small, astonished relief. Her answer was not a dramatic declaration, but the kind of acceptance that arrives with practical tenderness. Scheduling flights, arranging visits, finding a school that might have a good substitute teacher. It was the sort of love that asked to be part of daily life, rather than to be glorified on stage. It was the kind of love a child could test and accept. When Lucia asked that evening if the fellowship was like a test, Carlos kissed her forehead. "Yes," he said, "it's a test of how brave we can be when we're afraid." He did not promise everything would be easy. He only promised that they would be honest about the fear, and they would make a plan that kept Lucia's world secure. Outside, the city breathed on, its snow turning silver with streetlights. The lanterns of the festival, stored away until spring, loomed in his mind like a future inventory of wishes. He put Elena's card on the table where he could see it, like a small manual for a fragile machine. The card read her name, the number, the small address of a publishing house where paper and heart met in equal measure. There were steps to take: Pilar to be reassured, Teresa and Joaquin to be treated with continued respect, Elena's editorial colleagues to be gently reminded that a life is never only one thing. There were also small, immediate actions: buying new crayons for Lucia, accepting a borrowed pot from Dolores for the kitchen because old pots make better stews, arranging the logistics of a semester that might reconfigure their domestic map. Carlos picked up the phone again, slower this time. He keyed Elena's number and felt his thumb tremble as he placed the call. He did not know then whether the semester would lead to a fissure or a deeper seam. He only knew that the card in his pocket had become something else, a hinge. "Elena," he said when she answered, the word carrying a softness that lodged behind his ribs. "I don't want us to rush anything for the wrong reasons, but—" He stopped because sometimes the most honest sentence is simply, "I want you to know how careful I am." Elena interrupted gently. "I want to ask Lucia something," she said, and in her voice was the buoyant, practical courage of someone planning to build rather than renovate alone. "Can I take her to the press on Thursday? There are cookies, and I want her to meet the team." Carlos looked at the card on his table, at the neatness of the letters, at the number that had first felt like an accident. He thought of the way Lucia had announced tests and used them as a moral measure. He felt, suddenly, that every invitation was a question of consent and heart. "Yes," he said. The word was both a permission and a small vow. He imagined Elena in the press room, handing Lucia a cookie and showing her around, the noise of printers a lullaby of a different kind. He imagined Pilar's cautious acceptance and Teresa's hardened face softened by the sight of Lucia reading aloud. He imagined Remedios arriving with stew in a thermos that smelled like memory. He imagined the fellowship letter, a promise of steadier pay, and the plane ticket that might carry him away, but might also carry them toward a new shape. He felt fear, yes, but he felt something else as well, a beginning that respected the dead and allowed the living to continue. He folded Elena's card and placed it back in his pocket, where it touched the crumpled receipt from the restaurant and the photograph of Mariana tucked into the book he was reading for a class. It was, he realized, the most honest collection of his life. Love held, losses remembered, small invitations to try again. He texted Elena the address for Thursday, and then, to himself, as if naming the moment could make it steadier, he whispered Lucia's rule aloud: "You must not make Papa cry." He promised, under his breath, that he would not ask any adult to replace a memory. He would only ask them to share the future. The phone buzzed with Elena's quick reply, a string of words that spoke of cookies and a quiet tour and a book she thought Lucia would adore. Carlos allowed himself, for the first time in a long while, to breathe in without catching at the air. The snow outside had begun to brighten as the streetlights warmed with evening life. Inside, the apartment hummed with small, manageable noises: Lucia's quiet breathing, the kettle cooling, the steady, hopeful thrum of plans being drawn. He had been rejected today for being poor, shown the distance his life could divide him from others. But sitting now with Elena's name, with a future punctuated by a fellowship and the slow, patient work of shared parenthood, he felt a different narrative unspool, one where dignity could be reclaimed not by spectacle, but by daily acts of care. When Lucia turned in her sleep and murmured something about birds and hats, Carlos smiled. He thought of Elena's books, of lanterns not yet released, of a life that might fold in new pages without tearing the old. He took up his phone again and, with a hand steadier than before, saved Elena's number under her name. Then he stared at the small, simple script and let the city's distant sounds fill the spaces between his breaths. Outside, Madrid kept its traffic and its lights and the small, relentless business of life going. Inside, a father and his child slept. A newcomer had asked, gently, for permission, and a letter of possibility sat like a faint warmth inside a worn pocket. The next day would bring schedules to negotiate, cautious conversations to be had, and the slow work of earning a child's trust. Tonight, there was a small, careful hope. Carlos tipped the card once more, touching the name he had learned to say aloud. Then, before the day closed, he typed a message to Elena. "Thursday is fine. Thank you for the cookies." He hit send and watched the dot of delivered appear. It felt like the first small brick in a path he did not yet know the length of, but that he was willing to walk. He folded his hands and, for the first time in a long time, slept without the small, biting ache that had lived at the edges of his nights. The card remained in his pocket like a promise, and the snow outside softened into the kind of weather that suggests thaw. When morning came, Lucia would wake and ask about cookies and tests and whether angels laugh at cookies too. Carlos imagined, and in the answering, he felt the gentle architecture of a life under repair, honest, messy, hopeful. He did not know how the rest would go, but he would keep the card and the number and the memory that a woman had once left on a table in a restaurant, a simple invitation. Lucia woke before the light had climbed fully into the room, her small voice a question that had nowhere to land but his chest. "Papa," she murmured, twisting the blanket into a flower, "do angels laugh at cookies?" Carlos blinked awake, the apartment still holding the soft, domestic evidence of the night, the kettle's cool whisper on the counter, his coat slung over the back of a chair, Elena's card folded into the pocket of his trousers like a promise you could touch. He smiled in the dark and reached for her hand. "They probably do," he said, half lying, half inventing a safety. "But if they do, it's because the cookies are very silly." Lucia considered this and then, with the decisive logic of a 5-year-old, pronounced, "Then we should be very kind to them, so they are not too loud." They ate toast and jam and the last of the supermarket oranges. Lucia insisted on wearing her small blue hat with the pom-pom, the one she believed made her look like a pilot. She practiced saying "thank you" under her breath until the words sounded like spells. Carlos packed a small backpack with a notebook, a pencil, and the photograph of Mariana tucked between the pages like an anchor. He did not tell Lucia that the fellowship letter had a line about wages and a start date. There was no reason to make the day measured by paper. He would carry those negotiations inside him as a separate, quieter weather. The walk to the press room took them through streets that were beginning to shrug off the last of winter's weight. Steam rose from a grate, curling around the hem of passers-by's coats. A dog barked in a rhythm that somehow made the city feel like it belonged to everyone in it. Lucia pointed at everything, a pigeon, a puddle shaking off light, a woman balancing a stack of laundry, and named them with a priestly seriousness that made Carlos laugh aloud. The 10-minute trip felt like an expedition. The press room sat behind a low brick facade, its windows misted with the breath of printers and the small domestic labors of a neighborhood publication. Elena stood inside the door before they reached it, her hair caught up in a loose knot, one hand holding a paper bag. She saw them and unfurled a smile that looked like someone who had been practicing kindness in small doses for a long time. "Lucia," she called, and the child flung herself forward as if hurled by the word. Elena bent down, offered the paper bag like a consecrated object. "Cookies," she said, as if this explanation were all that was needed. The press room smell was a kind of inked sunlight, coffee, oil, paper, rubber bands, and the faint chemical hush of toner. Machines hummed and clicked in the back room like tired beasts, and a pile of freshly printed flyers lay on a counter, flapping once and then still. On a shelf, a row of battered children's books sat like veterans of many hands. Elena took Lucia by the arm and showed her the way to a stool. "Do you want to see how stories are made?" Elena asked, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial murmur. Lucia nodded as though agreement were an act of state. She perched on the stool and held the cookie as if it were a talisman. Carlos stood a little apart, watching the exchange. The strange protective reflex he had carried for years, to make himself as small as possible so his needs would not take up space, had softened in the last days into a cautious readiness. He had rehearsed boundaries in his head. No one would be asked to replace Mariana. No one would be allowed to pretend grief could be smoothed over with good intentions. But the readiness to let someone share the edges of their life with his daughter felt new, like an instrument he had learned to play only now. Elena guided them through the room, showing Lucia the stacks of paper and the old typesetter's tray with its drawers of letters. She explained what each machine did with the patience of someone who loved each step of the process. At one point, she sat on a low stool and pulled from the shelf a book of birds with bright illustrations. "This one always makes me think of tall hats," she said, turning the page. Lucia's eyes widened. The bird looked as though it had considered wearing a hat and decided to try. "Would you like me to read?" Elena asked. Lucia's assent was immediate. She settled into Carlos's lap, the child's weight a familiar geography of warmth. Elena read in a voice that never tried to be anything but clear, making comical noises for the birds and softer sounds for the quiet pages. She was good with rhythm. Where Carlos tended to annotate everything inwardly with worry, Elena let sentences have their own breath. From a corner of the room, Pilar watched. She had come in for an errand and lingered by the coat rack, the lines at the corner of her mouth softening as if the press room's little theater were a balm. Teresa arrived not long after, bringing with her the exactness of someone who had learnt to guard the edges of her life. She nodded at Carlos, then at Lucia, and took a chair near the table. The three women, Elena, Pilar, Teresa, exuded a domestic authority that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with steadiness. Remedios slipped in a few minutes later, carrying a metal thermos. The smell that spilled from it, lentils, rosemary, cumin, was the kind of thing that demanded gratitude. She set the thermos down, frowned at the idea of cookies as a full meal, and then took a cookie herself with a glance that said she would not be judged for small rebellions. They sat like a constellation, Elena with her book, Pilar with a knitting project she pretended was for someone else, Teresa with her lips pursed against too much feeling, Remedios with stew. Lucia read a sentence out loud, stumbling over a word, and then triumphantly managing it on the second try. The women applauded in different ways. Elena with an encouraging smile, Pilar with a small clap, Teresa with a quiet "brava," Remedios by offering an extra spoonful of stew to whoever wanted it. Carlos felt the rightness of the moment like sunlight warming wet clothes. He had feared that his daughter's grief would be something other people could not hold. He had feared, dimly, that interest might equate to pity. But here was a room full of people who did not look at them as a project. They looked at Lucia as if she belonged to the world, and in doing so, they taught Carlos that belonging might be extended without cheapening what had been lost. Elena, while pouring a second cup of coffee, asked a question that was careful and immediate. "How's school?" she said to Lucia, but her eyes checked with Carlos for permission to ask more. The question was a small test, an invitation to talk about the day-to-day rather than the big, raw shapes. "We did a test about numbers," Lucia said, folding her hands, proud of the mundane. "I drew a hat." Elena laughed softly. A very good answer. After a while, Carlos and Elena took a small stroll outside the press room. The city had warmed under the sky, and people moved in purposeful arcs. Elena's step was quick, the kind that hid a reservoir of stillness. She lowered her voice. "How are you?" she asked, direct as a neighbor leaning over a fence. He told her something only partially true, enough to be honest, but not so much that it would require a response he did not yet know how to bear. He told her about the letter, about the fellowship's cautious hope, about the idea of steadier pay. He did not, at first, say how many times he had thought of leaving, of taking a plane ticket and trying a life that might allow him to breathe differently. There were things that still needed to be tested in his chest. Elena listened. When he spoke of Mariana, a shade passed across her face. Not pity, but the precise, respectful attention of someone who knows the edges of sorrow and does not step on them. "There are spaces here," she said finally, indicating the press room with a small motion of her hand. "Small, steady ones. People who come and go, who read, who bring soup, who watch a child learn to say words. It's not charity, it's neighborhood." Carlos wanted to say the word that worry commonly makes, better, but he only nodded. "I'm afraid of needing something and having to ask for it," he admitted. The confession tasted of old shame. "You won't owe anyone your heroism," Elena said, as if pronouncing a small oath. "You'll only owe them honesty." They returned to the press room. Lucia sat on the floor with a crumpled comic and a pencil, drawing complicated maps of hats and birds. Pilar had made tea for everyone and allowed herself a generous slice of cookie. Teresa had, to Carlos's surprise, produced a stack of second-hand schoolbooks and set them on the table, saying, "Maybe this will help at home. They're small things, but they add up." Remedios filled a bag with extra stew. "Take this for the night," she said to Carlos. "A good dinner makes fewer bad dreams." The visit lasted longer than Carlos expected. At its end, Elena folded a small leaflet and handed it to him. "If you want to come by again," she said, "we have an after-school reading hour. It's short and chaotic and mostly about snacks. You're welcome." He put the leaflet into his pocket beside Elena's card, the fellowship letter, the receipt, the photograph. His pockets had become little temples to possibility. He thanked her and meant it, and as they left, Lucia waved at everyone as though they had been family all along. The afternoon held small administrative duties. The fellowship required an in-person meeting to finalize hours and contracts. It required signatures, a small orientation talk, a list of expectations that read like a promise and like a demand at the same time. Carlos arrived early and sat in a corridor with other people who had their own bundles of hope. He watched them, each carrying something private in their hands: a child's drawing, a photocopied certificate, an anxious pet cat held in a carrier. There was a communal softness to the waiting room. The woman who greeted him behind the desk had spectacles that slid down her nose when she read. Her name was Marta. She had worked in the fellowship for years and had learned the protocols that made aid feel less like charity and more like partnership. She shuffled the paperwork, checking columns of boxes. The conversation was, in its own way, a negotiation about trust. "We can't offer full-time hours immediately," Marta said. "It's part-time to start. We have some flexibility for parents who need to be with their children." Carlos leaned forward. "I can do evenings," he said, thinking of the press room's gentle light, "and I can do weekend shifts when necessary." Marta hesitated. "There are certain checks," she said, and beneath the phrase he heard the weight of bureaucracy, the ordinary need to be accountable, the inventory of appearances that public help requires. "We'll need to confirm your references and run the standard paperwork. Also, training next week." That phrase, "training next week," brought a small, unshed relief. He was not being rescued. He was being invited into a structure. It felt less humiliating. "But," Marta added, looking at a column that seemed to carry her own small fatigue, "we do prioritize single parents." Carlos's mouth made a quiet sound like gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "That would help." "And there's one more thing," Marta said, as if the last clause were the most necessary. "We'd like you to come in for a short meet and greet with our family services coordinator. It's just to make sure we can support you in ways that matter." He agreed to the meet and greet. The coordinator proved to be a man named Victor, soft-voiced and careful. He asked questions in gentle circles about childcare, about hours, about whether Carlos had any health considerations the fellowship should know. Carlos answered them while remembering the many times officials had spoken to him like an inventory of deficits. Victor listened without measuring his replies against a rubric of suspicion. At one point, Victor asked about Lucia's schooling and whether there were any particular challenges. Carlos thought of the night he had spent mapping grief like a constellation inside his head. He thought of creating a life that would not demand the replacement of memory. "She's learning," he said. "She likes birds and hats." Victor laughed. "That's an excellent curriculum." The paperwork moved forward. There were signatures and copies and a card with a start date. It felt, in the end, like the kind of small officialness that could be used as a scaffold for daily life. Carlos left the office with a slip of paper that said his first shift would begin the following Monday. The fellowship's pay would not be a fortune, but it would be steady. It would be a place to be accounted for, to have tasks, to have a clock to punch, or an email subject line that confirmed his hours. On the way back toward the apartment, he stopped at a small florist and bought a sprig of eucalyptus. It felt almost ceremonial, an offering or an oath. He thought of laying it on the kitchen table, where Lucia's crayon drawings lived like flags. The city around him continued with its patient, indifferent life. Buses sighed, windows reflected late sun. Two men argued thoughtfully about football. There was, in the public cadence, a reminder that his fears were private currents inside a larger river. That evening, as Lucia arranged her toys for a solemn bedtime parade, Carlos opened the fellowship letter again. He traced the start date with the tip of his finger and then folded the page and tucked it into the same pocket where Elena's card and the photograph rested. He ran his thumb over the image of Mariana until the print was soft. "Do you think angels like oatmeal?" Lucia asked, determined to test the theology of snack preferences. "Maybe," Carlos said, "but only if it's been stirred properly." They both laughed. Small laughter, not the kind that erased sadness, but the kind that made it possible to breathe. The week that followed settled into a pattern of small acts. Carlos negotiated Monday evenings with Pilar so she could watch Lucia while he worked the fellowship shift. Teresa agreed to help with weekend laundry runs in exchange for a favor he had not yet asked for. Remedios stopped by more often, bringing food that tasted like care. Elena sent brief messages, nothing invasive, only the sort of notes that become a rope between people. A poem she thought Lucia would like, a link to a children's story time in the park, an extra copy of a book. Trust grew inconveniently, in the best way. Lucia began to expect Elena's visits on Thursdays. She prepared questions for her like a small scholar. Each week the child's vocabulary unfurled a little more. She learned the word editor and declared herself an editor of hats. Carlos began to sleep through the night more often. His dreams lost some of their jagged edges. Saturday arrived thin and white, with a light that made the city seem almost tender. Carlos had a double shift at the fellowship, and, for the first time in a long time, felt the hum of a scheduled life. He waved Lucia off to Pilar with a sense of something like peace. Work at the fellowship was busy, in the plain, organizing way of institutions that keep simple promises. Classes taught, meals distributed, a phone line answered. He found satisfaction in practical tasks, sorting files, making a list, crossing off items. There was a modest dignity to it, the sort of honor that comes from the steady practice of being useful. At mid-afternoon, his phone vibrated. It was Elena. She wrote, "Are you free tomorrow? There's a small event at the park, lanterns. Lucia would probably love it." Carlos's first impulse was to say yes because Lucia loved lanterns. His second was to run through logistics, the fellowship schedule, Pilar's availability, the price of a bus fare. He replied quickly. "We'll try," he typed, and then added, as if the phrase might carry more authority, "Yes, we'd like that." That night he dreamed of the plane ticket again, an irrepressible, ridiculous dream in which tickets multiplied like birds and he could not decide which to take. The dream woke him with a start, but when he lay there, he felt less panic than a patient, preparatory grief. The possibility remained, but only as one of many roads. He had, for the first time in a long time, more than one plausible way forward. Sunday at the park turned into a small epiphany. Lanterns bobbed like patient moons held by children. The organizers had strung lights between trees and set up a table with paper and markers. Elena found them and smiled like someone who had given the day its proper light. Lucia made a lantern with a bird and a hat drawn on the side, and then insisted on carrying it as if her hands had been given a new job. Neighbors from the press room and the fellowship mixed in the park, small constellations overlapping. Pilar arrived with a thermos and a blanket and sat with Teresa and Remedios. Carlos watched from a short distance, a tide of gratitude rising in him. He watched Lucia hand her lantern to him at one point. She wanted him to hold it because she was tired. He took it and felt the lantern's fragile heat against his palm. They walked home under a sky with a tentative clarity. At the door, Elena hesitated, her posture not quite that of a friend, but of someone aware of the need to step backwards when boundaries were not yet solid. "If you ever need anything practical," she said, lightly, as if offering a simple tool, "or someone to stand in line with you for paperwork." Carlos understood and accepted. The day had given him enough solidity that he could let the offer rest like an unopened ladder on a shelf. He thanked her, and when the door shut behind them, he felt the strings of the world settling into the places they were meant to hold: family ties, community proximity, and the slow work of wages. That week, a small envelope arrived at the apartment. It had been delivered without fanfare, slipped beneath the door like a note of old friendship. Inside was an invitation from the fellowship, a notice of a short ceremony honoring local volunteers. Carlos read it twice. The letter said nothing about his past or about Mariana. It simply invited him to be present as someone who had recently joined their ranks. He folded the notice and carried it to the kitchen table, where the eucalyptus had begun to dry. He sat and allowed himself, for a moment, to imagine a future made of such small formalities. He imagined an apartment with a shelf of books Lucia knew by heart, a calendar with lines penciled in for shifts and playdates, a pocket with enough cash to cover an unforeseen bus fare. He imagined, too, that none of this would erase the ache. Rather, it would make the ache sit in a different room of his life. On the morning of the volunteer ceremony, he went to the fellowship earlier than needed. The room was bright with people who had come with pastries and thermoses, with children trailing. Someone called his name when he arrived and introduced him as our newest colleague. The phrase felt peculiarly good in his mouth. Pilar beamed at him from a corner where she had arranged a small bouquet of wildflowers. Teresa offered him a quiet nod that was a benediction. Remedios pressed a packet of soup into his hands. After the ceremony, someone from the fellowship, an older woman named Anna, who had the habit of speaking plainly and of not letting illusions persist that did no one any good, pulled him aside. "We've got a small training next month," she said, and then, lowering her voice, added, "And there's a temporary grant for someone who can help with the after-school program. It pays a little more than the basic stipend." Carlos felt the ground tilt. What would they need, he asked, because only action felt real enough to hold. Mostly supervision for a group of children, reading activities, snack preparation, Anna said, listing the small, steady requirements, and someone who can be there consistently. He thought of Lucia's small face illuminated by a lantern, of the way she had come to expect the kindness of a press room and the letters tucked into a pocket. He thought of the plane ticket that had once seemed to hover as an ultimatum. He spoke quickly, as if catching a train. "I'll apply," he said. "I can do the evenings." Anna smiled in a way that suggested both relief and calculation. "We'll see what we can do," she said, "but it's good to have someone like you willing." That afternoon, Carlos came home with another slip of paper folded into his palm. The sense that he was being considered for something that would change his evening routine, that would enroll him willingly in the architecture of other people's lives. He found Lucia drawing yet another bird in a hat, and when she saw him, she abandoned her pencil and flung herself at his legs. "How did it go?" she demanded, as children do, making the world a question. "It went well," he said. He lifted her up and kissed the top of her head. "Maybe better." She clapped both hands. "Are we the best?" she asked. "We are getting there," he said. "We are getting there," he said. It was the truest answer he could offer. As the days moved, obligations and kindnesses braided together. Carlos began to understand that dignity could be recovered by degrees, by the accumulation of ordinary honors. A scheduled shift, an invitation to an event, a neighbor bringing stew. His poverty, once a public embarrassment that sought to shape his identity, became a fact among others, a fact that did not define every conversation he had. He learned to ask for help without phrasing the request as a confession. There were still hard moments. The plane ticket continued to rustle in the back of his mind like a bird eager to leave its cage. On nights when Lucia was feverish, or when a bill arrived more urgent than the others, the old panic returned. But now, those nights felt visited instead of occupying, the way storms pass without erasing the coast. One evening, after a long day at the fellowship and a reading hour at the press room that had gone smoother than he'd dared hope, Carlos stood at the kitchen window and looked at his reflection in the glass. The pale light of the street made his face look like a map. He took Elena's card from his pocket and turned it over in his fingers, the letters smudged slightly where his thumb had rubbed them. He thought of all the small documents he carried now, an orientation pamphlet, a start date slip, the fellowship letter that spoke of modest wages and a start. He imagined, briefly and without shame, the plane ticket once more. This time, the image was less a rescue and more a possibility, like a route on a map where one pin could be swapped for another. He did not yet know if he would ever use it. He only knew that he had enough room now to entertain different answers. At the table, Lucia spread her drawings like a small constellation. She had drawn each of the women who had become their neighbors. Elena with a book, Pilar with knitting, Teresa with a stern smile that softened, Remedios with a thermos. Carlos looked at the pictures, at the way his daughter had captured not what they had done for them, but who they had been. Calm, practical, human. He slid the photograph of Mariana out of the notebook and smoothed its corners. He whispered her name to the empty room, as if it were a blessing. Then he placed the photograph back, the image warm and present in the paper. Outside, Madrid breathed the same rhythms it had always breathed. Buses, voices, the slow passage of unrelated lives. Inside, a small convergence held. Work that paid just enough. Neighbors who had become a patchwork safety net. And the patient magic of a child's laughter. Carlos felt the life he had been given not as a renovation of the past, but as an honest extension of memory into new spaces. When he finally lay down that night, his phone buzzed with a message from Elena. "There's a small volunteer fair at the community center next weekend. Thought you might want to see what's there. No pressure." He read the message and smiled. He answered, "Thanks, we'll come." He set the phone on the bedside table and, with the habitual reverence of someone cataloging gifts, arranged the items in his pockets. Card, photograph, slip of paper, until they felt like a tidy constellation. Carlos slept, and in the spaces between dreams, he felt the future arrange itself in small, consecutive acts. A reading hour, a fellowship shift, a park with lanterns, a steady paycheck. None of it erased grief. None of it pretended to, but it formed a scaffold on which to carry the aching things. He thought of Lucia's rule, "You must not make Papa cry," and honored it by promising to ask others to share the future rather than replace the past. Morning arrived with a pale clarity. He dressed quickly, kissed Lucia awake, and found her already plotting the day's adventures. As he stepped out into the street, he carried with him, in a way that would not have been possible months before, an openness to possibility and a respect for the work it took to anchor a life. He kept walking forward, a man with pockets full of small promises, a child who believed in the laughter of angels, and a city that continued to offer both hardships and the tiny graces that make surviving an act of communal intelligence. The rest of the week lay ahead like a map whose routes were being drawn by his feet as he walked. He did not know which roads he would take first, only that there were several in front of him now, and that, for the first time in a long while, he felt the patience to choose.